All right. I have a few moments after 3 o'clock, so I'm going to get rolling. Thank you all. Fantastic turnout for this mid-afternoon keynote lecture. I'm Scott Harpin. I'm a professor in the College of Nursing here at Anschutz, along with Dr. Emmy Betts from Emergency Medicine and our team from the Firearm Injury Prevention for Registered Nurses Project, the FIPERN project. We welcome you guys to this amazing keynote afternoon that we have. I'll be introducing Dr. Jacquelyn Campbell here shortly. I did want to give a shout out to Rachel Kennedy. Dr. Rachel Kennedy, where are you? So I can you can get, she has stepped out for a moment, of course. So I want to throw her kudos. But she has been working with Jackie all day today, getting her from talk to talk with doctoral students and the ED. And it's just, Jackie said, load me up. I want to make sure I'm here and answering questions and meeting with as many people as possible. For those of you who don't know about the FIPRN program, we're still debating, is it FIPRN, FIPRN? It's going to be the nomenclature is going to keep going on for years, we hope. This is a R25, a short-term research training program that we won an award from the National Institutes of Health, National Institutes for Nursing Research. We have 12 of our amazing scholars here from across the U.S. Here in the front rows. One of them is snowbound and joining us by Zoom, Danielle, who's at Boston College. So we will acknowledge that we have a bunch of people on Zoom, including one of our scholars who's here. And we're going to have a series of really fantastic keynotes for the next 3 days. So we invite you to check out our website to learn about those. This is a really fantastic cross-disciplinary project. College of Nursing, School of Public Health, School of Medicine, Emergency Medicine. So we're really quite proud of a number of players, the deans, division heads who have supported us in this work. Dr. Campbell is going to speak until just before 4 o'clock, and then we have a really wonderful panel of guest speakers who are going to give a community response, who will be up here after that. So we hope that you choose to stay at 4 o'clock for another 45-ish minutes or so to hear about policy and some of the things going on here specifically in Colorado. So without further ado, I'm going to do your awesome bio first. So we'll chill for a sec. So Dr. Jacquelyn Campbell is a professor in the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. She's published more than 300 articles, 7 books, and has been PI on more than 15 major National Institutes of Health, Center for Disease Control, and National Institutes of Justice grants in her decades of advocacy policy work. She collaborates with domestic violence survivors, advocates, healthcare professionals, and marginalized communities. She's particularly known for her research on domestic violence homicide and the development and validation of the danger assessment tool that helps IPV survivors more accurately assess their risks of being killed or almost killed by their abusive partner. Her research identified gun ownership by the domestic violence perpetrator as one of the strongest risk factors for intimate partner violence. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Nursing, the Board of Futures Without Violence, and the boards of 4 domestic violence shelters. She's provided consultation for DHHS, the CDC, National Institutes of Health, World Health Organizations, a bunch of them, Office on Violence Against Women, Department of Defense, and is just really a leader, a national leader, international leader at the intersection of gender-based violence and physical and mental health outcomes, including gun injury. Would you please help me welcome Dr. Campbell?
All right, so which one of you are the fellows? All right, congratulations. I want you to know Hopkins tried to get this grant. We were not successful. So we're very jealous, but glad I get to be a small part of it. And Rachel, so yeah. And I had the great pleasure of being Rachel's advisor for her PhD dissertation, which is awesome. And her work was awesome. And so I'm glad that she's here because I know she's found a good home and she's going to be doing a lot of interdisciplinary work with all of you and other people who are not here. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed my title. This is like, all of this work I've done, all of these publications, all of this stuff. And we have as much domestic violence homicide today as we did in 1996. And so I'm like, so, Jackie, you either need to go in a different direction or we need to do work better. And more lifespan work and more, we need to be informed by new thinking. So I try to read a lot. And I always do a land acknowledgement wherever I go because I work with Dr. Teresa Brockie, who's at Hopkins, who's Indigenous, who said, I must. So she taught me to do that. So I always take the time to look a little bit at wherever I am, at what the history is. And these are the original owners of your land. One of the things to keep in mind is that it used to be that Indigenous people were 100% of Colorado's population, and now they are 1%. So your state, along with most of our states, has sort of systematically destroyed Indigenous peoples. And we forget that, I think, at our peril. I know it's not the style now to talk about the history of our country in ways that makes children feel bad or something. But I think we have to, because those trauma trails come down to people now. And I always recommend Judy Atkinson's book. She's Aboriginal from Australia. And her book, first of all, last time I looked, it was $1.99 on Amazon. So you can afford it. Number two, it's very skinny, so you can read it quickly. And it's full of wisdom, because Judy talks about, because just like we in the United States adopted the boarding school way of assimilating our Indigenous peoples, they did the same thing in Australia. And the policy was literally to take kids from their homes at 4 years old, force them to go to these boarding schools where literally the language and culture was beaten out of them. And they were only allowed to go home 1 week in the summer and 1 week at Christmas. So if you can imagine only seeing your children, and if you can imagine the trauma trails that leaves in those kids, in your families. So Judy talks about how it was for her people and how that intergenerational transmission of trauma has resulted in more domestic violence and child abuse amongst her own extended family and also in her community. But the other reason I like the book is Judy is a therapist. And so she weaves messages of healing, how to help her own family heal, how to help her own community heal, oftentimes through the arts. And I love, the paintings you have in this building are just incredible. And so, one of the things is the arts can help with healing. And so I also put a picture of this building. And so you on campus have a wonderful heritage. And we do at Hopkins kind of, but not nearly the kind of work that you do here. So those of you that are not working with your Native American studies, your Indigenous scholars, you might want to think about how can we work together on these issues of violence. There's also the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Project. The website is still live, where it well demonstrates how many murdered and missing Indigenous women we have, disproportionate to other groups, particularly among the missing Indigenous women and girls, because basically nobody bothers to look for them. And when an Indigenous woman is murdered, nobody bothers to find out. Nobody works on, and this nobody is an overstatement, but very seldom does anybody find out who killed her. And so, those are one of the continuing legacies in our country that we need to acknowledge and take account of and make sure we think about these issues. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Project lasted for 5 years, and it's now done, supposedly. There's no more domestic violence amongst Indigenous peoples or missing women, like, ha. But, those are the kinds of things that we need to try and figure out how to continue this work and make sure that we are looking for missing Indigenous girls, that we are solving the cases of homicide on Indigenous women. So intimate partner violence, these are the definitions. And we know intimate partner violence can be physical violence for sex. It also can be psychological violence. Does not require sexual intimacy. And stalking is also incredibly common form of domestic violence. The psychological violence, I think important, are acts that cause physical, sexual, or psychological harm. So psychological violence is oftentimes people, kind of disagree about how do we measure that? If we're talking to an abused woman, how do we say for sure that she has been psychologically abused? And for instance, name calling. Now, a lot of couples fight. A lot of couples have disagreements. Some couples call each other names and they're like, yeah, that's just what we do. When we get mad at each other, that's what we do. Other couples are like, yeah, there's certain things we don't say to each other because we have decided that that causes harm. So one of the best definitions for psychological violence, I worked with a postdoc who was doing work in Tanzania. And she asked focus groups of women because she was trying to figure out what was psychological violence in Tanzania. And they said, when he does something that hurts my soul. I think, okay, that you got. It's not necessarily what the person does to you or says to you. It's what it does to you that makes it be violence. And I think we have to be careful about defining for other people what psychological violence is. I work with abused women. I have talked to literally thousands of abused women, and they have many different stories, and whether or not they feel like they are being emotionally abused, psychologically abused, that's up to them. I don't get to say, oh, this and this and this has happened to you, therefore. So I think we have to be careful about our definitions. And I know we have to do that for measurement, but just in general, and this is from the NISVIS, the National Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Assault Survey. CDC, you may have heard, is having some problems. And anyway, so the NISVIS survey, the actual data was taken down, and it's sort of back up, but not exactly to actually have the raw data to be able to do anything with it. Same with the MVDRS, if you've worked with that data. That's now back up for the moment, but I don't know, because that whole violence prevention section of CDC is gone and done, at least for now. So this is the data from the 2016 NISVIS. And one of the things, 27% of women and 12% of men have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner and reported significant short or long-term effects, such as PTSD, symptoms, and injury. So, yes, significantly more women than men, but significant numbers of men are experiencing intimate partner violence from partners. We don't know whether it's same-sex partners or a female partner or some other type of person is the partner there. But sometimes in this field, we think it's only women who are experiencing violence from partners. And we need to be very clear that it's oftentimes men, and these are significant numbers. The other thing for women is that there's overlap in these types of violence. And this is from a study we did a long time ago. But I think that Venn diagram is a useful thing to do whenever you're measuring intimate partner violence, so you're clear. And, it's, I think I have. No, I don't. Anyway, obviously, if you're experiencing all three types of violence from a partner, you're going to have greater health effects, right? It just makes sense. But we have to realize that 18% of the women in this study said to us, physical violence only. No, he does not emotionally abuse me. And that's one of the parts of it also that sometimes I think we lose sight of. And 20% said emotional, psychological violence only. So that also, and they said, it was causing them harm. And forced sex, some women, that's the only violence they were experiencing from their partners. I just was an expert witness on a case where forced sex was it. But on the danger assessment, she scored very high. She was at the next highest level of danger, not at extreme, but at severe. So there's other risk factors for homicide that can go along with it. So just because, only experiencing something, you need to understand that some of those women can sometimes be in realistic fear for their life. So this is also, this data is from 2014 NISVIS. But I think in terms of the gender differences here, the hit with a fist or something hard, almost as many men as women have experienced that from an intimate partner. The kicked, slammed against something. Now, this is something that women experience far more than men do. And I oftentimes think of one woman I talked to that said, yeah, he sometimes hits me more like pushes and shoves me. But it's not that bad. I do get slammed up against the kitchen cabinets every once in a while. But it's really not that bad. I'm like slammed up against the kitchen cabinets. So tell me more about that. Well, it's not that often, maybe once a month, not more often than that. And how long has this been going on? Oh, 3 or 4 years. And I'm like, just, and guess what? She was in the healthcare system for chronic neck pain. And her primary care physician was saying, we've done all the x-rays, there's no physical basis for this. In other words, it must be all in your head. And the other thing that we have learned with the chronic pain is that there's the stress of abuse leads to inflammatory processes, which makes, I know my physiologist, people over here, yeah, which make for more chronic pain. And so, these intersections and more attention to some of the physiological effects as well as the physical injury kinds of effects is really important. So 14.8% of women were injured, again, from the NISVIS, 7.9% needed medical care, and that's the 2015 NISVIS. But equal numbers of men as women say they've experienced physical IPV and psychological violence, including coercive control. So just as many men in this country say they have been on the receiving end of controlling tactics, as do women. So one of the things that I'm like, okay, again, our numbers, if anything, of homicide are just as high as they ever were. So whatever the understandings and however I've worked on this, I clearly need to do something more and something different. So one of the things I've turned to is to think about what are the biases that are in our system that help or impede our progress toward doing more for domestic violence. So first of all, we've got the trauma trails in our communities. Now, I live in Baltimore. How many of you have been to Baltimore? Everybody. All right, never mind. I got nothing to say. No. So I love my city. I live in the city. But we have issues in our city. We have a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment. And for instance, our domestic violence intervention program, we have a wonderful, I'm sure many of you have heard of House of Ruth is an amazing domestic violence full service shelter and community center for abuse victims. They also have a really good intervention for abusers. It is court mandated, but they've done a lot with it to make it useful. However, now Baltimore's demographics, we're about 60% Black, about 15% Hispanic, and somewhere about, and depends on how you count, and you think you could count, but people don't seem to be able to very well. So somewhere around 25% white. When I go to that court mandated offender intervention program, every single abuser, men and women, is Black. And I'm like, so what do you think? You think there's no white abusers in Baltimore? You thinking that? You shouldn't be thinking that. we should think, what is it about our system where, white guys are less likely to get court mandated, less likely to get arrested, more likely to have the judge say, we're sure you can do better, just shape up. My son is now 50 years old. Is that possible? Yes. So he's 50 years old and he is a very successful businessman, and he went to Duke undergrad and Harvard MBA. He's got all the credentials, all that good stuff going for him. And when he was 13, his father and I got a divorce, and he was in a really bad place. And he did some serious property destruction. And I mean serious property destruction. And he and some of his friends, did some stupid stuff. And he got hauled into the police department and was told, good thing your father's going to pay this back. You have been, terrible. And we could send you to juvenile justice, but we're not going to. And if he had been Black, he would have been in juvenile justice in a New York minute. He did serious stuff, but did not get arrested. So one of the things we have is women of color oftentimes being afraid to call the police because they're not sure what's going to happen to their partner. And they're like, so even if he is being abusive, and Lord knows I want him to stop, I have never met an abused woman that said it was fine. Never, ever. They all want it to stop. They all see it's a problem. They're not denying there's an issue. But they're not sure they want him arrested. He's the father of her children, right? And so she has him arrested, especially if he's Black. He's going to become even more unemployable. He's going to have another, prior on his record. And what good does that do her and her kids to have a partner who is unemployed? What good does it do her and her kids to have a partner who has another mark against him in the criminal justice system? So she thinks twice, 3 times. And in Baltimore, we have a history of our police doing some questionable things over time. And so, does she want him in the hands of our police? And I bet you the same thing with women of color in Denver. But they're not sure. And do they want to disclose to us in the healthcare system that they're abused if it's a woman of color? Knowing that women from marginalized background, women of color, are more likely to lose their children for failure to protect than are white women. So if if we ask about abuse, which we should be doing, so she's going to think about it twice. Because are you going to report me to CPS? Are you going to make me talk to a social worker who might not treat me with respect? And you better believe these women have been amongst us before and have formed their opinions about us as healthcare providers. So, it's up to us to prove to women of color that we can be helpful about domestic violence, and we're not going to report them to CPS. So it's almost like, especially if it's in prenatal care, it's almost like you have to start your ask about abuse with, just want you to know, we do not report anybody to CPS unless there's demonstration of child abuse. And now I'm going to ask about domestic violence. If that's true, now is that true? Yeah. For if there's domestic violence? So if the child witnessed it, there is a mandatory report. So you better tell women that's what you do. And you can say, so we are concerned about women experiencing violence, and we do have some possible places where you might want to go, and there's some services you might want. But, don't disclose to me because I'm going to report you to CPS. Basically, that's what you need to say before you ask about domestic violence. So I'm all about routine screening, but you better tell people what's going to happen if it's a yes. And that's pretty, compared to the rest of the country, that's pretty rigid reporting than other places have. And you're just not going to get much disclosure. So those are some of the things we need to think about. We also need to think about, what about our people who use violence against partners? And notice my language, not saying perpetrators, saying people who use violence against partners. Because the more we, put demonizing words on people, the more likely we are to think they can't change. So, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. Ta-Nehisi is a Pulitzer Prize winner, wonderful author, happened to grow up in Baltimore. And in that book, it's not skinny, but it's very powerful. He talks about growing up on the mean streets in Baltimore and being scared and trying to act tough, look tough, be all of his tough guy stuff on there. Because, heaven knows you wouldn't want your buddies to think you were quaking in your boots. And now he says a lot of those kids that were with me are either dead or in jail. And he talks about his father using the belt on him. And his father was also interviewed when the book first came out. And his father is like, I didn't beat you that often, and only when you deserved it. And it was in order to toughen you up. And Ta-Nehisi says, but I was little. And it scared me. And it was, really traumatic for me. And his father is, well, you grew up fine, you see? And Ta-Nehisi's like, yeah, but that was mostly luck. And the other thing that Ta-Nehisi had is that one strong, consistent, caring adult who helped with the healing. It happened to be his mom, but that's incredibly important for kids if they're not going to grow up terribly traumatized and using violence. So the other thing is we find that many of these kids are subjected to structural biases, micro and macro aggressions, violence from peers, etc. The other example of this, I don't know why all these Baltimore guys, but our governor, Wes Moore, He also has a book called The Other Westmore, because there's another Westmore that grew up and ended up in jail. And our Westmore is our governor now. But he also talks about that one consistent, caring adult that he had in his life. Now, the problem is, if the one consistent, caring adult in these kids' life is an abused woman, she may not have the bandwidth to do the caring stuff. So that's why programs like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, et cetera, are so incredibly important. Mentoring programs for our kids in school, all of these things are incredibly important. And any kid who looks different, acts different, or who has slow developing social skills, that these are part of the complexities that underlie our problem in domestic violence. And we have to understand this beyond the notions of power and control. We need to, one of the things I say is human beings are complicated. And we can't assume that every abuser has the only motivation of having power over and controlling their partners. There's much more than that goes into it. And there may be power and control tactics that are taken, but that's not the sum total of this person. And I think if we don't do some things to change abusers, to improve their behaviors, then we're not going to get anywhere. If we think, well, every abused woman just needs to leave, so how does that solve our problem? If he goes on and abuses somebody else. And again, that's what women want. They want him to change. They don't want him to go to jail. So I have turned now to 21st century brain science to help me with this, because like I say, I wasn't getting it before. So, and I think this kind of stuff is incredibly important because it shows us what happens to the brain, the developing brain, in trauma situations. And what is more traumatic than witnessing domestic violence for these kids that are witnessing domestic violence? So, in a protective environment, the brain develops to support reflective self-regulation. Now, don't we all like to think we are the epitome of reflective self-regulation at all times? We're probably not, but we like to think that. But in a threatening environment, there's actual changes to the amygdala, motivational circuits, promoting anxiety, inattention, hypervigilance, greater sensitivity and reactivity to emotional information, poor regulation of behaviors. So, that dysregulated 4-year-old, witnessing domestic violence, we know forever that that's the number one risk factor for going on to abuse a partner as an adult. So we used to think it had to do with learning. Now we realize it's more to do with trauma and what trauma does to the brain. So doesn't that sound a lot like PTSD? Except imagine a 4-year-old with PTSD. So, and we know that 0 to 4 is the most neuroplasticity, the most chance to do the healing work if we can with those kids. What kinds of interventions have we got for little guys, 0 to 4, who have grown up in violent homes? Don't have so much that's specifically targeted to them. What an important time. So how many of you have had a 4-year-old in your life? Okay, so 4-year-olds are a mess anyway. And if they've witnessed domestic violence, they're a real mess. And, the 4-year-old with terrible temper tantrums, who oftentimes gets kicked out of nursery school, right? Because Mrs. Jones, you have to take your child home and teach them to be able to control their behavior. And they can't come back to my nursery school until he learns or she learns how to behave. And you're like, okay, so if this is an abused woman that gets this child back home, what are the chances are that she's going to be able to help? What else happens with that 4-year-old? A lot of temper tantrums, a lot of times wets the bed, So, and that kid is in serious trouble, because how many of our nursery school teachers get special content in how to help kids heal from trauma? We barely pay them anything, let alone give them special content on that. But that would be a wonderful opportunity for early intervention, prevention kinds of things with those kids. So the other thing is, somebody called this amygdala hijack, that if the brain's been traumatized, that all of this stuff's going on, and when the amygdala gets poked or they get triggered, so little Johnny or Judy is presented with a difficult situation and is unable to process it, that where usually our prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex kicks in, and we have empathy there. We try and teach our kids, well, your friend that kicked you on the playground might have been having a bad day. Maybe we don't say it exactly like that, but let's give that child some grace and let's help you process that. But this kid that's been highly traumatized, oftentimes that prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex are totally silent. And I've seen some of the brain scans showing this. In the traumatized brain, you get all kinds of actions going on here and goes straight to behavior. No mediation in the frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex where the learning occurs. So we think we're going to teach kids to not be violent. Not if they've been highly traumatized. That's not going to help. We need to do healing stuff. So, we think about adult PTSD, adolescent PTSD, and 4-year-old PTSD. We need to do healing stuff. So what heals people from trauma? What is healing strategies? Nature. Been with me before. So nature is incredibly healing. And so our nursery schools kids need to be able to get outside. And you guys in Denver, you got the most gorgeous nature there is. So the, school age kids need to take walks in the, up the mountains. They send, you guys have Camp Hope here, which is specifically designed for traumatized kids. in nature, but there's not enough slots for everybody that needs it. So, one of the things you can do in your spare time is, the funding mechanism for Camp Hope, give a little extra. We could even plant trees. In poor neighborhoods, there ain't many trees. That's a small thing. But those are the kinds of things as a community that we need to think about. Music is incredibly healing. And yet most of it, at least in Baltimore, I don't know about here, but most of our poor schools don't have music classes and don't have instruments that kids can borrow. That's the kind of thing that could really help on a larger scale to get traumatized kids in a better place. The other big neuroplasticity age group is adolescents. The other group of kids that are really hard to deal with are adolescents. And a traumatized adolescence, even more so. So even, we need to double down. When a kid starts to act out in middle school, instead of being sent to the principal, how about if they got sent to music class? Have a chance. And of course, you got to get it early. You can't wait until the kid totally destroys something. But, that's the kind of strategies we might help our teachers be able to learn with kids. All right, so we have our adult abuser. It's got a traumatized brain. And we used to think, I knew and loved Ellen Pitts. She was brilliant. But all of her work, the power and control wheel, et cetera, and so forth, she developed in the 1990s. I am convinced if Ellen had the advantage of the kind of brain science we have now, she'd be all about, let's use that. Let's figure out how to do that. Let's figure out how to heal those brains. And rather than saying there's no such thing as losing your temper, that brain science shows with traumatized brains, it's all about losing your temper. And so we need to think about what are some different things we can do. Dan O'Leary has developed a RCT tested couples counseling program for couples who are using low-level violence. They carefully find out from the partner whether or not abuse is still happening, and they interview them privately, et cetera, and so forth. So they're keeping track of that. But it's very useful. So couple counseling can be helpful. And it addresses some of these issues. Counseling, we know, can be helpful for traumatized brain. The other thing to point out is you see how the hippocampus is attached very closely to the amygdala. So some of the triggers can be from nightmares. Or re-experiencing the trauma from the old PTSD stuff. So the part of that, though, is that sometimes it's not nightmares in the classic sense, but you can get fragments of memories that can be very traumatizing. So my woman that got slammed up against the kitchen cabinets, she said, the other thing is I'm sure I'm going crazy, because sometimes I walk into the kitchen and I get a panic attack for no reason. It's my own kitchen. And I'm like, yeah, makes sense to me. So she also needed some counseling and benefited from it. I'm not saying that we ignore what our women need. So I'm on the board of Futures Without Violence. They have lots of wonderful free materials in terms. Also, they have materials on how to ask about domestic violence and how to refer. And they also have coaching with courage. It's called now. It used to be Coaching Boys into Men. So all of their materials are free on the website. So you can get the Cadillac version of Coaching Boys into Men. You can bring people from Futures in, and they'll teach all the coaches in your town, in your community, how to do the Coaching Boys into Men. Or you can do the free version and download, and they're called Coach's Playbook. And you open it up, and it's got tips for coaches to teach nonviolence, along with how to kick the ball, how to hit the ball. They've got one for every sport you can think of. They got all kinds of different covers you can pick. It's all for free. And we all know the kids listen to their coaches at a certain point more than they listen to their parents. And so if their coaches are giving them these tips, it can be helpful. So this is from Melissa Jelson's This Is Not a Love Story, came out 10 years ago. But I always show that women who are murdered by partners come from every different background, every different walk of life. And this deputy was murdered a few years ago by her partner, who then killed himself. So that's the other thing that I think we need to keep in mind, is that not only are women most often murdered by a husband, boyfriend, or ex, and that's 9 times the rate that are killed by strangers, but also it's one of the leading causes of death, especially for young Black women, young Indigenous women, and even white women. We also have immigrant women at increased risk to be murdered, more so than US-born women. And there's lots of issues around that, but we don't have time to get into it. But those of you that work with immigrant women, you need to be sure and pay attention to those issues. When women are murdered by a partner, 72% of them have been physically abused before they were killed. So that's the #1 risk factor for domestic violence homicide. Women are more at risk when they're leaving or have left. And we know that immediately after she leaves for good is the most dangerous time, but the whole first year is also dangerous. And we know there's been an increase in rural domestic violence homicide. And importantly, women are far more likely to be the victims of homicide suicide than are men. Somewhere around 30% of the women who are murdered by their partner have been, it's followed by the suicide of the male partner. And that percentage seems to be increasing. So one of the take-homes there is the one risk factor that's different for homicide suicides is he has threatened to kill himself. And again, if Ellen were here, she'd say, just another power and control tactic. He's just trying to control her when he threatens to kill himself. And I say, if he's threatening to kill himself, we better get him some interventions for suicidality. or else he's likely to take her with him. And that can help save her life. You know, it's not coddling. It's not failing to hold him accountable. It's trying to do what we can to intervene. And women who were murdered in our study, 47% of them were in the healthcare system before they were killed. They were in prenatal care, some of them were in the ED, but they were also in primary care, in mental health care. They were amongst us, and we failed to get them whatever services they wanted. So there's more murders of men in this country, but women are much more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner. So the dynamics are different. And we've all heard homicide is down in this country. Homicide of men is down in this country. Homicide of women from domestic violence is not. Children are involved. Women are abused while they're pregnant. Nurse-family partnership, which has an incredible home here in Denver. Recent RCT trial where if you use the intimate partner violence module, we get significantly less domestic violence in those families. So definitely worth adding to nurse-family partnership. And, you know, in Pennsylvania, every infant who is born in a poor home, or every woman who gets pregnant who's poor, when the woman knows she's pregnant, there's automatically nurse-family partnership visits. And that's because of policy that has come in that. And we also have less child abuse when there's NFP. There we go. All right. Homicide. So the most homicides of women are by abusers. Somebody in back is missing. You see 1996, and it went down until 2016, and then back up again. So this is, you know, what keeps me up at night. I'm like, how can that be? The first Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1996. And now we've got more. So, no, my screen is weird. All right. So this is Colorado. And there's the national line. There's Colorado's line. So you've been above the national line in domestic violence homicides the last couple of years, which, you know, is going to make you think, right? And here's the domestic violence homicides with guns. So one of the things that's happened since 2016 is our country has, there's been a lot more gun ownership. And our percentage with guns of domestic violence homicides has gone, it was always more than 50%, and it's now up to 70%. So, all right. So we've talked about some of this. These are some of the health outcomes for abused women. All of this has been demonstrated by research. Her suicidality is important. The number one reason that women come to the healthcare system is they say, I can't sleep. Give me something to sleep, you know, which makes sense. And we also have all this physiological stuff that we're getting smarter about. I clearly had too much. I just want to end here